For some PLC applications, using recipe data is a really effective way to accomplish handling different types of products that you may run. So you have a standard format of program, and then you have a certain number of variables that will contain recipe data. So in this particular application, I'm using three variables that will be recipe data: length, width, and speed. The first step on the PLC side is to make sure that you have these set up as global variables. These will be accessed by the HMI, and the recipe data, when you're using recipes, is stored in the HMI, and then that data is sent down from the HMI into these variables. So to see how we do this setup, let's go into our HMI. So first step is to go into our variable mapping and make sure that we have the variables that we want. So we have length, speed, and width. And you can see then inside the HMI, there are variable names for the length, the speed, and the width. Now down the left-hand side of the Multi-View Explorer, you'll see recipes. Go ahead, right-click, and then click Add Recipe Template, and it'll create Recipe 0. So inside Recipe 0, right now we have no ingredients. So we need to go ahead and add some ingredients into this recipe. So we can click the plus sign down at the bottom, and it's going to give us options to start adding ingredient names. So what I can do is I can come in and just type length, because that's what I want that particular ingredient to be called. And then in the variable, because we started creating the variable names for these already inside the HMI, I can select new controller 0 length, and we can just give it a default value of 0, for instance, if you're starting a new one. And then I can do this for width, map it to the option for width, same thing with the default value, and then also with speed. And what this will do now is as we select recipes, the HMI will know what the target variable is on the PLC for each of the different recipe ingredients. So now we have recipe 0 with these three recipes. So now let's go into our page. And I've already added a couple of, or a handful of buttons that we'll talk about later. But what we need to do is come into our toolbox, and we need to find our recipes. So we can search for our recipe viewer, and then we can drag and drop a recipe viewer into our page. Now, going down to properties for the recipe viewer, what we'll need to do is we will need to map the template to the recipe 0 that we have. So we're going to call this recipe 0. So now the displayed template that we're selecting is going to be recipe 0. As we load data and we start to save recipes and things like that, we will need to save it onto the HMI. So to do that, we have these push buttons down here below. So we have add, copy to new, write to NJ, read from NJ, save, delete. And then we also have a field in here for recipe name, which is just a text box that I labeled recipe name for the variable that will hold that information. So to interact with the recipe viewer, there are some VB scripts. So to access the VB scripts, you'll want to right-click on the page name and then select View Code Editor. Now I've already written these, but once we're inside of here, if we select F1, this will take us into the help menu, and then we can expand function and expand recipes. And you can see that there are a number of these different functions that we can use. So for instance, write to NJ is a subroutine that I wrote, and it's using the write recipe to controller function. So if I select write recipe to controller, it has this syntax. So it says write recipe to controller, and then the first argument is the recipe template name. So here I've got recipe 0, and that's based off of the name of the recipe template that I created over here. And then it has the recipe name, which is part of an object or a structure that's created under recipe viewer 0. So for recipe viewer 0, when we start adding recipes, each recipe has a name, and then this will help it to select those, the recipe information or the ingredient values from that particular recipe, so that when you select write recipe to controller, it pulls the recipe name from this recipe template and it sends that data down. So again, I've already created all of these. And then the only other one that might be good to know is that if you want to do a save as, that you also have to add the recipe name on that particular function for save recipe as. And again, inside the page, if I come back to the page, in this text field, I have that recipe name, and I can just use that variable inside that recipe name. So to demonstrate how this works, what I'm going to do is go back into the PLC, and I'm going to do simulation, run with NA simulator, so we can see how this works. So we'll click OK, and it'll take a minute to control or build the controller, and then also get the soft HMI running. And sometimes this can take just a moment. And once we do that, what we'll do is we'll show how to work with the recipe viewer, and then also show the data being updated inside the PLC. All right, now we have the simulation running with the HMI as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a quick watch tab page. So you can see I've got length, speed, and width, so we can see these values. So what I'll do is I am going to create a recipe. So I'll call it my first recipe. And I'm going to do add. So it created my first recipe. And you'll see that all the values are 0 because we put that default value in the recipe template, that all of those would have default values as 0. But I can come in here and edit this. So I can say, let's set length to 5, width to 10, and speed to 15. And then I can say save. Okay, and let's create a second recipe. So we'll just come into the variable or to the recipe name, and I'll just say my second recipe. And then when I make that change, I'll do add, and I can click on my second recipe now and do the same thing. So I'll just say like 17, just make numbers that are clearly different. Oops. Just so you can see how this looks. And then just say save. So now that I've saved it, so I have my second recipe and I have my first recipe. But if we look down at the online value in the PLC, all of these still say 0. Because in order for me to get the recipe values from the recipe viewer into the PLC, I have to use these functions that were part of those VB scripts over in the code template over here. So now I'm going to say write to NJ. And now you can see that 5, 15, and 10 are in for the length, the speed, and the width. And so that is how we get that data from the recipe viewer to the PLC. Now if I take my second recipe, highlight that, and I write it, now the values have changed to the value in the second recipe. So anytime you actually command one of these write to or read, it's going to take whichever recipe you have highlighted and write that data down into the PLC. Now, if for some reason you're changing values on the length, the speed, and the width in the HMI, you can change it from the recipe viewer, or if you had another page that had ways to enter variables, you could do that as well. So let's just say I was on the HMI and I changed the length in here to 37. So now I have 37, 15, and 10. So if I come back to the HMI, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into new recipe name. I'm going to change this to my third recipe. I'll say add. And now I've added a third recipe. So if I come to my third recipe, you can see that all the data values are 0. But now I'm going to do a read from NJ. So read from NJ, if I press this button and click on my third recipe, you can see that the data values have now updated. So it's 37, 10, and 15 based off of what's in here. So let's say I've run for a little bit and I think, actually I need to change that to 38 just to tweak it a little bit. I could change that to 38 inside the PLC, read from NJ, open it again, and now you can see it shows 38, 10, and 15. Or I could save inside here. I could change this to 11, and then I could save it. And then anytime you make changes, that'll save it onto the HMI. Or if this recipe is really nice for what I'm doing and I just want to make a minor tweak for a different product, I could create my fourth recipe. And then I could highlight my third recipe and say copy to new. And then if I open my fourth recipe, you can see that it actually has the same values as my third recipe. And then I could just change this to a different value for the width. And now you can see that the differences between those two are just the value in the width. So again, with the recipe viewer, you need global variables inside the PLC. You add a recipe template inside the HMI. You add the ingredients, map them to the proper variable, add the recipe viewer into your page, add push buttons, and these push buttons, if you select events and actions, then you can call the subroutines after you have an event, so click or press or whatever, and inside the code, you'll create this type of code information. So it's fairly simple, and if you even wanted to, you could just pause this portion of the video to see some examples for how to put that in. And then once you have all that set, then you can run your HMI and begin writing all of your different recipe templates.